Why don't you start talking?
Good morning, church. Good to see you. Welcome. If you don't know who we are, my name is Jordan, and this is Amy, and we have the privilege of pastoring this community. And you have joined us for Question and Response Sunday. And so this is something that we piloted in January, February after a series we did there, and we got such good feedback. At least the people that enjoyed it told us. The ones that didn't say anything. So we're going on that. And so we decided to, after this series, have another Q&R Sunday. So what happened, we did a series on purpose for 4 weeks, this teaching series. And then we throughout that, we opened it up for questions. And people have sent in different questions throughout the last 4 weeks. And we have the opportunity to answer 5 of those. But let me just take a moment before we jump into the questions to tell you why we do this. Because this, in my context, I'm not familiar with lots of churches that do things around like this where you guys get to decide what we talk about. But for us, one of the values of this place is we want to be curious. We want to be curious. We love curiosity. We invite curiosity. We're not scared of questions. We're not scared of us wrestling with some of the harder topics of places that have tension within our faith. In my experience, I get to sit down with lots of different people in all kinds of stages of their spiritual journey. But what I've found over the years is individuals that maybe they've been a follower of Jesus for a while, they will start to hesitantly communicate a doubt that they might have, or a place or an area that they feel a bit confused, or it doesn't really add up for them, or there's some uncertainty. But they say it in such a way that they just feel like, I know I shouldn't say this, but I just don't really understand how this could happen to my mom, and yet God's good. Like, it just doesn't, they don't align. And there's almost this unspoken reality that's in discussion that, like, I shouldn't have doubts. Like, if I'm to be a good follower of Jesus, am I to be a good Christian, that I shouldn't have doubts. And almost always when we have these conversations, before we even jump into the topic, I get up from my chair and I go pick out this book. And I read them, this one paragraph in this book about doubt, in which Timothy Keller wrote in his book, The Reason for God, a great resource to me over the years. But this is what he says about doubt that I think is really helpful, and I hope it's going to be helpful for you today as we frame this Q&R. This is what he says, quote, "A faith without some doubt is like a human body without any antibodies in it." I'm going to say it again. A faith without some doubts is like a human body without any antibodies in it. People who blithely go through life too busy or indifferent to ask the hard questions about why they believe as they do will find themselves defenseless against either the experience of tragedy or the probing questions of a smart skeptic. A person's faith can collapse almost overnight if she has failed over the years to listen patiently to her own doubts, which should only be discarded after long reflection. Believers should acknowledge and wrestle with doubts. See, the reality is we all have doubts about our faith. There's different areas of doubt that we have, and we have a tendency to ignore them and pretend they're not there. But what happens is those doubts just grow and become a spiritual toxin. That I've found some of the most beautiful moments of spiritual growth and some of the beautiful moments of faith actually happen when I dive into those doubts and explore those doubts and give those doubts some place to room. So I say all that to say this is why we do these moments, because we really value here being curious. And places like Alpha where people can come and discuss that, and Sundays and our small groups around living rooms. These are all places that we invite and encourage curiosity, because we actually think a life full of faith is one that's full of curiosity, and they're not opposed to one another. So we're not scared of questions. We invite them. We'll see after how well we respond to them. But
yeah, and so as you probably have already figured out, if you've been attending here for any length of time, we're not experts. We certainly know some things, but we are also still on the spiritual journey. We are also still wrestling. We are still learning. We are still growing, and that is the beauty of the Christian journey, is that you will never cross a finish line during your time here on earth. And so we in ourselves are growing in these different topics and as we continue to work through series and that kind of thing. But we want to make sure that we are continuing to have open opportunity to discuss these things and bring things to the surface, or perhaps we missed something that you were like, oh, I just really wanted to know about, this. We want to provide the opportunities for those questions to be asked, because perhaps it was something we did know and we didn't even think to cover that because, we learned that a while ago, or, vice versa. So we're really excited for today. We're excited. Thank you so much for submitting your questions and tuning in week to week, that you would be stirred and be thinking critically about these things. So as we begin, we just want to review, we were in our series on purpose. And does life have meaning? What gives life meaning? And so we went through four weeks. Our first week, Jordan spoke on design, and that's talking about if we are created, if we are designed, that means we have purpose. And so what does that look like if you have been created with purpose? Because we can really only know that purpose if we know the person who designed us. And so Jordan dove into that. The second week was on self-discovery, and that's the idea of when we know ourselves deeper, we can know God deeper, that we can know how we interact with God, how we interact with the world around us, etc. That having that firm identity that is built on the identity of Christ, when we have that, our relationship with God is that much more robust. And then the third week was, we talked about guidance. How does God guide us? How do we hear from God? Obviously, there needs to be an element if we are going to follow the purposes and designs that God has set out for us, we need to be able to hear his direction. So that was the third week. And then last week was on calling, which is always a big question about, what is my calling? What is my purpose? How do I know what that is? How do I wrestle with that and that kind of thing? So Jordan talked beautifully. If you missed any of these weeks, you can find them on our website and on YouTube. So make sure you go back and catch up on all of those, because they were all great. So without further ado, we're going to jump into our first question.
So we had about 13 to 15 questions. We're going to answer 5 questions today, and we try to answer 5 that answer several of the questions. And so even some of these 5 questions, there's a couple of them built into it. So if you are upset that we didn't answer your question, you can send an email to jeff@forestcitychurch.ca, and because he chose them, you can talk to him about that.
No, he didn't. Poor Jeff.
Question number 1.
We owe you,
Question number 1. Do you think Jesus was actually an introvert? Do you think Jesus was actually an introvert? And if I was sitting down with this person, I would ask, do you think you're an introvert? This is probably coming from an introvert, but maybe not. But was Jesus an introvert? Well, as we see in Jesus' life, if you've read through the Gospels and the biographies of Jesus, there are many times where Jesus retreats. And Jesus enjoyed his times of solitude, and Jesus went away from the crowds. We read that some of these spectacular moments of ministry, there's huge crowds around him, and he just slips away. Or there's many times he leaves the disciples. There's many times where Jesus seems to have levels of introversion in his life, where he just seems to be far away from the people around them. Yet, at the same time, Jesus seemed to be the life of the party at the different parties he was at, right? The first miracle he performs in John's Gospel, there's a wedding and they've run out of wine. So what does he do? He makes more wine. He wants the party to keep on going for the rest of the night. And there's like these moments where he's at tables or parties. He invites himself over. There seems to be people all around him. He seems to live his life relationally communal with others as well. And so Jesus seems to be both living in these tensions of these two realities. I guess before we even go forward, I'm kind of interested, how many of you in the room would, show of hands, would say you're an extrovert? You like to be out with people? Wow, okay.
How many of you extroverts were like, that's me, that's me, that's me, that's me.
How many of you would say you're more introverted? Wow, look at, it's almost 50-50. The introverts are here hanging out with us. That's great, that's a joke. So I think when we talk about extrovert and introvert, we should acknowledge that it's not a black and white issue, right? You're not either an extrovert or an introvert. Like, we're all like on the scale of what I would call introversion. In fact, Susan Cain wrote a great book called Quiet. It's how to find the power of silence in a world that just can't stop talking. and she's an introvert, and she wrote a book about being an introvert and how it's a superpower. It's a great book. If you're an introvert, I would highly recommend reading it. But she talks about how there's like a scale of introversion, and we're all somewhere on the scale of that. And so some of us are more closer to the introvert side, and some of us are more closer to the extrovert side. But we're all on that scale. So if you are someone that would say, I'm more of an introvert, that I'm further down the scale to the introvert side, not the extrovert side, well, that probably would mean that you need to know that there's times, as being an introvert, that you have to be around people. In fact, that God's put things in you, that there's a spiritual growth, there's a spiritual maturity, there's a spiritual transformation that can only happen when you rub off with other people, right? And if you're more on the other scale, if you're more extroverted, then I have friends that are extremely extroverted, and the scariest thing for them is to be home alone with their own thoughts and no distractions. They say, that sounds like a nightmare, Jordan. Why would I ever want to do that? But we also need to know that God meets us in those moments. And Jesus got away and had these moments where he was in solitude with the Lord because God speaks in a way that he can't speak in the crowds, in the busyness, right? But the idea is you need both. You need to have both in your life, wherever you find yourself on the scale, knowing that your greatest strength can be also your greatest weakness, that you might lean more into one or the other, that your tendency would be not to see anybody for a few weeks. Or your tendency might not to have a free night, or sit in your room and journal, or just have a quiet moment to yourself, right? Your tendency might be either of those, but they can create challenges when we don't acknowledge the different parts of who we are. So the big idea is that Jesus demonstrated both. And more importantly, Jesus had a real self-awareness of who he was and what he needed and when he needed it. I'm always surprised there was moments where Jesus could continue on with the crowd. There's thousands of people around him, and the writers say, and he just left. He just disappeared, or he just found some moments. Like, you think those would be the moments that he would step in and the limelight, but he would just, because he knew what he needed, and he knew there was times where he had to be more introverted and extroverted. So what's important for you is that you just take an assessment of where you're at and what you need and where you function, and being aware of that, but also knowing whether you're the biggest introvert or the biggest extrovert, that you also need times of silence and also need times in relationships with others. Anything else?
No, I think, and just to add a little thought to that, perhaps you haven't ever considered it, or you think like, oh, I like people, I think I'm an extrovert. As Jordan said, it is a spectrum, but also knowing yourself, those seasons change, and the things that you need change. And so what worked for you 5 years ago, perhaps now you are in a busier season, and it takes more effort to get quiet, that there's intentionality.
That's a great point. COVID taught us lots of things, right? But Amy and I thought forever that Amy was more of the extrovert individual and I was more of the introvert individual. But then COVID happened, and we were all stuck in our house. And Amy's like, I could live this life for years. If I don't see anyone else, this is actually really great. Where myself, when the mailman came by, I'd always, how you doing? This is great. I'll go with you to the next house.
He's not kidding.
I got nothing
He's
to do.
not
We
kidding.
can go like 10 blocks, right? And we just realized in those moments that actually I'm probably more extra, that I come alive when I'm with people. I need moments by myself as well. And so that's like being aware of those things and just taking notice of them and knowing what you need. And the people close to you can probably tell you. If you have a good friend or a spouse, you could ask them, hey, do you think I'm extroverted or introverted? And the idea is that there's awareness of yourself, and because there's awareness of where you slip into and what you need and those different things.
Just to add to that, not to make it all about us.
Question 2, we gotta keep
I know,
going.
let me just finish this one thought. In that same vein, it is interesting, and I'm sure those of you that have gotten to know Jordan and I, you would be surprised to hear I'm an introvert. But what I've learned is I love people best when I have the opportunity to be introverted, and I show up for people with patience and time and a listening ear. And that's why that is important to know that about yourself, because I've learned, I didn't know this before, because we'd be with a big group of people, we'd be with extended family for a few days, and I couldn't figure out why I would get cranky. And I've learned now that in those moments, I just need to take an hour, go off by myself, have some quiet, go for a walk, and my batteries are enough for a charge that I can continue on with the family circus. And so that is why knowing those things about yourself and being aware of where you're at is important, because you do love people well when you know yourself. Yeah. So, second question, How do you navigate when you feel disconnected from God's purpose? That's a great question. And quite simply, I think the thing we have to dial back to first, if we look at the basics, is what is our purpose? And on a universal scale, we could address that question from why did God create us? What is the purpose of people in general? And, there's lots of very beautiful answers to this, and to put it quickly, the idea that, God has created us both so that I would say from a place of love, that he created us to love God and to love others, and that we are to live this abundant life both in connection to God and connection to others. And obviously it does not take any kind of theologian to know that is a little bit fractured in our world, and those pieces are a little bit broken. But very basic is that when we feel disconnected from purpose on just a really broad level, that is to be, what is our purpose in our connection with God is the first piece of that. So we talked about this a lot in how does God guide us, but I would say the suggestion that is just so practical that I think it is that starting place is go back to the basics. I've heard, I think it's Tiger Woods, it might be another golf great, but in him coming back, I think it is Tiger Woods because he's had 5 comebacks at this point, but he's over time, he would his game would decel a little bit and he wouldn't be as sharp as he used to be, and he'd go back to his original swing coach that taught him his basic swing, and he'd start there again. He would start at the swing, that it was this is where it all comes down to. I'm not a golfer, I might be completely screwing that up. This isn't even a motion in golf, so that tells you how much I know. But basically, the basics are where the foundational blocks are built. And so in that, it is giving the opportunity for those moments of connection with God. So that is those moments of quiet. It is those moments of reflection. It is being with others that you are having these conversations with, that you're figuring out, having somebody pray for you. All of these pieces that are helping to build that foundational relationship with God. Mark Buchanan has this beautiful book, I quote it often, called Spiritual Rhythm, and it's looking at our relationship with Jesus through the seasons. And it is so beautiful because it gives purpose. I was just having a conversation with somebody about this the other night, to all of the seasons, of the winter seasons that we just want to get through and get to summer. But the necessity of these seasons of sometimes God is just so close and you can feel him, and every time you open up the Bible or you have a conversation, you just have such a sense of richness and just such a place of abundance. And then there's other seasons that you're walking through and you're like, it is such an effort to even open the scriptures. It's such an effort to get to church. I'm just not enjoying it. But there is purpose found in every season if we're willing to look for it. So I would just encourage you, if that's you, if you're feeling disconnected, continue to run the plays, not in a veneer kind of a sense, but you're continuing to have the practices. You're continuing to walk through having prayer time and all of these different aspects. They are important, and they will bridge you through to the seasons of abundance again. Yeah. Did you want me to continue on with this little part? Did you want me to answer that?
I wanted you to let them know about your Mother's Day gift you're wearing today.
My candy necklace, just in case I get hungry. Just kidding. My daughter our daughter made this for me for Mother's Day, and it was my favorite piece of jewelry I put on this morning. So I actually think she's in here today, so she's really happy that I'm wearing it. So anyways, sorry she didn't make it.
I'm open for some jewelry for Father's Day.
Yeah, okay, we'll get you a nice big chain with a clock.
Do you want to move on? Question 3?
Sure.
Good?
Yep.
Question 3. What if I discover my purpose and I hate it? Then what? And they even put the emoji in, and I kept it. So I thought it was great. So what if I discover my purpose and I hate it? Then what? Crying emoji. Great question. I think I want to lean back into something I quoted last week with Frederick Buechner. He said, your purpose is found, your calling and your purpose is found in when the greatest need in your context and your greatest gifting come together. It's at the intersection of those two. So what's the greatest need around you? And what's the greatest gifting? What's the thing that God's gifted you to do uniquely? When those two come together, the intersection, that's where you find your purpose. And so the idea of I've discovered my purpose and I hate it, I'm like, well, is that your purpose? Because I think God actually gifts us uniquely with things that where we come alive when we do them. That there's certain things that, some of you, the idea of standing or sitting on this stage and doing what I do right now, that would be your biggest nightmare. And some of you, I know what you do. That would be my biggest nightmare. I wouldn't want to do that, right? And so there's an idea that God's gifted us with something that we could not do anything else besides that. I love what David Brooks says about vocation. He says this: a person does not choose a vocation. A vocation is a calling. People will generally feel they have no choice in the matter. Their life would be unrecognizable unless they pursued this line of activity. In other words, God's just gifted you. He's made things in you. He's put certain passions and strengths and personality in you that's unique to you that you can't imagine doing anything else but you fill in the blank. And I'm saying it's not always easy to figure out what that thing is. It takes work. But the idea that you've discovered your purpose and then you hate it, as in, and I mean, purpose is a broad term here, so there's some questions I would ask, like, what do they mean by purpose? But again, I think it goes against the idea of where purpose is found. Purpose is found where your greatest gifting meets the greatest need. However, I want to put one caveat here that I think is helpful, and there's actually another question. I'm going to read it. Could ease or difficulty be a measure of whether you are living in your true purpose or not? So in other words, if life is going easy or challenging, does that communicate whether you're living in God's purpose or not? And I think this is a common conception within church. I hear a lot of time. So somebody will be telling me a story, and then they'll say this comment, but then I got the grant and it came through, so I knew God was in it. But then I got the job, and so I knew this was God's plan. Or whatever it is, but there's something about how it worked out, or things were easy, so then I knew God was part of it. And in the roundabout way, what they're saying is, like, if it's challenging, if it's hard, if it takes a lot of work, then maybe God's not in it, right? And I think there's a tension here we have to identify and acknowledge, that sometimes God calls us to hard things. Let me give you an example. Amy and I, moving to Burnaby from Victoria, where we had all of our kids and all of our community, and Amy's family was the hardest thing we've done in our lives. And in that year of first being here, so many challenges, so many setbacks. And so throughout that year, we could simply say, when another setback or another challenge came, well, clearly God's not in this, or this isn't God's plan, or this is not what God's purpose is for us, because this is really hard, this is challenging. But on the flip side, we're confident that this is exactly where we're supposed to be. And that after 2 years now of living in Burnaby, we are more and more confident that God wanted to do things through us that only could happen through this challenging season that would have not happened if we stayed where we were. That there was a spiritual growth, there was a spiritual maturity, there was things that God wanted to draw circles around that I just don't think it would have happened unless we went through the challenging season that we had. And so there is this tension here. And Andy Stanley has a statement. He's like, some tensions need to be managed and not solved. I like that. And I believe this is one of those tensions. This is a tension that we need to manage. We don't always solve it. Because on one hand, I do believe that following Jesus sets us up for long-term fulfillment and joy. And I think Jesus' model for life is one full of fulfillment. I think it leads to your best life that you can live on this planet. No question about it. But I also know at the same time that there's things that the Lord calls us into. We were just talking to someone this week, and we said, listen, you could take that step, and that would be great, but it would be the easy step. Doesn't mean it's the wrong one, but maybe staying in this step or making this decision, maybe God wants to do things in here that he can't do in that other season. So all I'm saying is the tension is that sometimes God calls us to hard things. So when do we know? That's the question, right? When do we know? When do we know that that what we're stepping into is something that we need to continue to have grit and resilience because God's in it and he's growing something in it? Or when do we know that, like, actually God's trying to tell us that this is probably not the best thing, that maybe we should, like, take a different path because clearly this isn't the step that we need to move forward? And the simple answer is, I don't know. I don't know what it is for you. And that's why I think the trifecta is helpful here when we involve good counsel, the scriptures, and the Holy Spirit. When we bring those in, we get discernment of whether we should continue on this path, whether it's being easy or hard, or maybe we should take a different path, right? And so just the reality is that this is a tension that every follower of Jesus is always trying to manage. And I was talking to someone even before we got started this service, and they were talking in their small group that through this series there's been lots of tension. I'm like, yeah, there is lots of tension here. There's lots of tension in trying to understand, like, what is God calling me to? And what is my purpose? And should I keep going this way or should I not, right? These are not simple questions for us to answer. But I'm just saying these are tensions that we need to manage that we don't always solve. And every scenario is different, right? And so that's why good counsel, the Holy Spirit speaking in your life, and Scripture are helpful for us to figure those things out.
Yeah, and I'm just going to add this little part because I think it goes in part to what you just said and what I had just said previous. It was a question that I'm going to sneak under the radar, but one of the questions was, I don't think it's going to come up on the screen. God's purpose seems so vague and hard to apply to day-to-day living. How can God's purpose be clear in everyday life? And I think that's almost the opposite, that it's like, oh, I feel like, something's hitting me in the face that I think is my purpose and I don't like it. And then there's other people that are like, purpose? Is that you? And I just want to give this really quick analogy of, the idea would be that if I had a friend that said to me, I'm thinking about getting married, and so like, what do you and Jordan do that makes your relationship special? And I
drive a minivan.
Drive a minivan. We like to live on the edge. So that was a joke, you guys. If I was to say like, we go to coffee shops together and we do bow staff fighting. Just kidding, we don't do bow staff fighting. That would just be really fun. And, we take our kids to the park and, we share cat videos together and we like to, read books together and all of these things. And so they were like, oh, those sound like, the ways that I would pursue a healthy marriage. So then they start dating somebody and they suddenly are like, check out all these cat videos, let's go to the park with some kids, let's, and they start doing all of these things. They might be nice things in themselves, but this other person might be a little bit, like bewildered and confused because there's no relationship that anchors all of those things that have come out. The things that Jordan and I enjoy doing together are the result of the time that we have spent over the years, getting to know one another, doing our life together, that all of these things are wrapped up in our relationship we have. And so when I think sometimes we're looking for purpose, but we disconnect it from our relationship with God. Right. That our purpose, and as I think Jordan said last week, I loved how succinctly he put this. Well done. Not that I'm biased.
Thank you.
But just that idea of, our primary calling is our relationship with God, and that secondary calling, that, that vocation or that other piece, that comes out of that primary calling, that you begin to uncover who you are. And so if that feels really hard to live out day to day, see question 2, go back to the basics. As you grow that relationship with God, the things that are unique in your relationship with God will begin to bloom. They will come out. So just wanted to add that.
Question number 4, we got a skedaddle here.
Pedal to the metal. Oh, I'm question number 4. Right. Why don't I receive burning bush moments? Now, this is a great question. This was actually a question that was raised in our small group that we added to these because we thought it was so good and people are wondering this. And the burning bush, just to give a little bit of context for those of you that might not know, Moses, the Prince of Egypt, if you've seen that movie, Moses is living in the desert. He feels like he's thrown his whole life away. He catches sight. He's out like tending the sheep, catches sight of this bush that is consumed with fire, but it is not burning up. And there, God meets him and speaks to him and says, you are going to set my people free, that you are going to be the liberator of the Hebrew people from Pharaoh, from Egypt. And so, often we look at these moments of, parting the Red Sea or all of these crazy things, and we're like, man, why doesn't God speak to me like that? And we talked a little bit about that in God calling us, but I think there's a couple things to recognize. The first one is, why do we desire a burning bush moment? Are we desiring a burning bush moment because that would be really cool and we'd love to see that happen, that there would be some cool miracle in our life? Or are we wanting to go deeper in our connection with the giver of that moment of a miraculous, circumstances and situations? And the point of the burning bush was not God being like, look at the cool party trick that I can do, but the burning bush was the moment that got Moses' attention so that God could speak to him and give him direction and purpose. And so I think that the burning bush, although that was miraculous, what was crazy about that story, if you think about it, if you read it, is that Moses actually says like I'm slow of speech. You don't take my, take Aaron, take my cousin or my brother, and he says, take him and use him. He's much better with people. He's an extrovert. I'm an introvert, and God's actually like upset with him. Like, this is the purpose I've given you. And I really take that to mean, even when the burning bush moment happens. Yeah. There is still doubt. We often think like, oh, if God would just show up like that, I wouldn't have any doubt at all. But even Moses still pandered and had like a little bit of like, I don't know, God, I don't know if that's for me. And so I think we need to remember that, even we actually are doing much better than Moses, because at that time in history, the Holy Spirit was not yet given to the people. To experience God was a completely different process than it is now, that we have the Holy Spirit as Christians living within us, and that we have moments that sometimes they're overt, but often, like, how many people have followed God over the years and have never had a burning bush moment? But there is so many more covert moments of nudges, of direction, of people speaking the right word at the right time through Scripture. The Holy Spirit illuminates those things for us. That is truly where the guidance comes from. So just because you have not seen a bush that has not been consumed with fire does not mean God is not speaking to you. Yeah. So pay attention, get quiet, listen, go back and listen to that message on God speaking to us, because there's a lot more detail in that.
Through most of our series as well, we try to give resources out, additional like books or podcasts or different things that we think are helpful around that subject. And so if you sign up for a newsletter, you can get it there, or if you follow us on Instagram. So we gave a few series around this, and one of them was around how do we hear God's voice, and that we think is helpful around that. All right, I got 6 minutes to answer God's providence. All right, question number 5. If
Small subject
is sovereign overall, why do we need to concern ourselves with what our purpose is? Won't His will be done one way or another? Great question. A question that if you've followed Jesus, even just for a short period, is a question that you ask. If God is sovereign, then why do I need to concern myself with what I do or not? Obviously, He's going to figure out what He wants to do one way or another. So this is a big question. People have written books and done their doctorates around this. So obviously we're not going to be able to unpack every aspect of this, but there's a tension here, another tension that we just want to draw a circle around. So the tension is this. The first reality is that He has what's called providence, that He governs the world, and that He has sovereignty, and that He predestines, and there's this idea that God's fully in control. But then on the other side, there's this reality of that we have free will, and that we're active participants in our destiny, in our future, and that God's given us free will, and God's given us the ability to make our own decisions. So how do we wrestle with those two things? And specifically, how do we wrestle with that within our purpose? Well, firstly, I think they're both important. So firstly, we need to acknowledge that there is a God who is sovereign, who is in control, who is writing history. I just read the Psalm yesterday, I think 58, and at the end of it, David is, if you ever read David, he's like an emo kid. He's always like, life's always hard for him. And he's writing this psalm, he's like, everybody's around me, everything's injustice, but the Lord will rule in the end. In other words, there is someone who's sovereign at the end. God will have the final call and the final decision, and that the injustice he's experiencing is temporary, right? And so I think there's great relief for us knowing that it's not all on us. That whatever you hear in the news tonight, or whatever is looking like, that there is a God who is in control and that who is sovereign, and that is working that out. But that at the other side, there's a part of like, okay, what part do we play in that? If God is sovereign, what part do we play? Well, I want to quote J.I. Packer. He's a theologian. He's recently passed away, but he was a theologian right here at Regent in Vancouver. Some call him one of the greatest thinkers and theologians in the last 100 years. And this is what he says around this. He says, quote, yet, and he was talking about God's sovereignty, and he says, yet the fact of free agency confronts us with mystery. Inasmuch as God's control over our free, self-determined activities is complete as is over everything else, and how this can be, we do not know. So in other words, one of the smartest individuals we've had that has worked and wrestled with these subjects is just saying like, oh, and actually this is a mystery. And the fact that God's in control, but yet we have self-determined activities and that we can determine what our future looks like. He goes on, he says this, regularly, however, God exercises his sovereignty by letting things take their course, rather than miraculous intrusions of disruptive sort. So there's a tension here, right? There's a tension for us to manage, not to solve. So I just want to give two observations around this. If God's sovereign, why does it matter what decisions I make? Well, firstly, it does appear that God invites humanity to take a role in his kingdom coming to earth. To say it another way, God doesn't need us, but yet decides to use us to play a part in his redemptive work. Let me read this Romans to you really quick, Romans 10. It won't be on the screen, I don't think, so let me read it to you. This is what Paul says. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So everyone who calls on Jesus will be saved. Well, the word is like experience life, the fullness of life. But then Paul goes on, he says, but how then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they, see how he keeps going this, right? How can they hear without someone preaching to them? How can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, he says, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. In other words, Paul is saying the linchpin, the connection piece of people hearing about the goodness of Jesus and experience of life, that humanity has a part in that. That you and I have a part in that. That God, in his sovereignty, has chosen to use you and I, imperfect with all of our stuff, and our imperfectness to speak his perfect love. So God uses us. And throughout history, we have seen God use imperfect people to communicate his perfect love and bring transformation in people's life, and they experience the love of Jesus in profound ways. Second observation. So for some reason, God uses humanity to take part in his redemptive story. Secondly, the decisions you make shape you. Isn't it interesting when Jesus asks individuals, when they are asking for healing, he says, what do you want? So he goes up to someone who's blind, or he goes up to someone who's crippled, and he says, what do you want? Every time I read that, I'm like, well, it's kind of obvious, Jesus, what he wants to see, or he wants to be able to walk. But I think there's something going on here. I think Jesus wants them to take part in their own healing. In other words, Jesus wants to give voice to what they need. That Jesus wants them to be an active participant in what's happening in. And I think what I've learned is the decisions we make shape who we become. We've talked about this through this series. But the decisions we make shape who we become. As the prayers you pray, they shape you. We become our prayers. So some of us can think, what is the point of praying? If God is sovereign, if he's going to decide anyways, why is it even important for us to pray? Because our prayers shape us. And they seem to change things too, but that's another conversation for another time. But our prayers shape us. We become our prayers. It's impossible for you to hate someone and pray for them at the same time. You just try it. You think of that person and you start praying for that person every day, and not like just have a script, but earnestly pray for them, that God would bless them, that they would experience fullness of life, that if you begin to pray those things would begin to change your heart, and it's almost impossible to hate someone and pray for them at the same time. We're going back in the Sermon on the Mount next week, and we're talking about divorce and marriage, and I was looking at these stats where divorce is about 50% in society, and that's true within the church and outside the church. That the church actually, there's no difference between the divorce rate within and outside the church. But there was one unique thing, though. They said there's a study that was done, that couples who pray together daily less than 1% of those couples experience divorce. And again, I think it goes back to that same idea, that it's really hard to let things fester and frustration and resentment to really have a space to grow when every night you humble yourself and you pray with one another. It doesn't give it any place to breathe. So in other words, your prayer life, the decisions you make, they shape you. They shape who you become. They shape those things. Neuroscience is beginning to tell us so much of this, that meditation and prayer actually rewires our brain. We're learning more and more about this. So I think those are a couple things. Obviously, it's a larger subject, but I think there's a couple things of why God invites us to take participation in our own story and that purpose. I'm going to invite the team to come back up, and we're going to transition, but why don't you close us out?
Yeah, so thanks, Jared. That was good. I'm glad we've solved all of the providence and sovereignty